Now in the 12th month, that is the month Adar, on the 13th day of the same, when the king's commandment and his decree drew near to be put in execution, in the day that the enemies of the Jews hoped to have power over them, though it was turned to the contrary, that the Jews had rule over them that hated them. The Jews gathered themselves together in their cities, throughout all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus, to lay hand on such as sought their hurt, and no man could withstand them, for the fear of them fell upon all people. And all the rulers of the provinces, and the lieutenants, and the deputies and officers of the king helped the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame went out through all the provinces. For this man Mordecai waxed greater and greater. Thus the Jews smote all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, and slaughter and destruction, and did what they would unto those that hated them. And in Shushan the palace the Jews slew and destroyed 500 men, and Parshadatha, and Dalphon, and Aspatha, and Poratha, and Adalia, and Aridatha, and Parmashta, and Arisai, and Aridai, and Vadjesatha, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, slew they, but on the spoil laid they not their hand. On that day the number of those that were slain in Shushan the palace was brought before the king. And the king said unto Esther the queen, The Jews have slain and destroyed 500 men in Shushan the palace, and the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is thy petition? And it shall be granted thee, or what is thy request further? And it shall be done. Then said Esther, If it please the king, let it be granted to the Jews which are in Shushan to do tomorrow also according unto this day's decree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged upon the gallows. And the king commanded it so to be done, and the decree was given at Shushan, and they hanged Haman's 10 sons. For the Jews that were in Shushan gathered themselves together on the 14th day also of the month Adar, and slew 300 men at Shushan, but on the prey they laid not their hand. But the other Jews that were in the king's provinces gathered themselves together, and stood for their lives, and had rest from their enemies, and slew of their foes 75,000, but they laid not their hands on the prey. On the 13th day of the month Adar, and on the 14th day of the same, rested they, and made it a day of feasting and gladness. But the Jews that were at Shushan assembled together on the 13th day thereof, and on the 14th thereof, and on the 15th day of the same they rested, and made it a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore the Jews of the villages that dwelt in the unwalled towns made the 14th day of the month Adar a day of gladness and feasting, and a good day, and of sending portions one to another. Amen. May the Lord bless to our hearts the reading from his word. Now we come to these final chapters of Esther. It may seem quite grim, the account of the Jews, but it's not hard to see it and to understand it as essentially self-defense. They were given permission to defend themselves. They were initially to be the prey, and because it was the king's decree, they would not, in one sense, lawfully be able to defend themselves. But the second decree going forth after Esther's request to the king gave them official permission to stand and to defend themselves. And it would appear that many of their enemies persisted in their desire and intent to hurt them and possibly to take away their riches, their possessions, but the Jews were prepared and the Jews were ready and the Jews stood as one against them, and the Lord gave them the victory. Verse 1 of chapter 9, as the time that had been decided by Lot, by Haman in the 12th month, drew near, in the day that the enemies of the Jews hoped to have power over them. They still hoped, despite the second decree, to have power over them, but it turned out by the providence of the Lord turned to the contrary, that the Jews had rule over them that hated them. And the Jews gathered themselves together, united together in the different places that they were throughout all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus, to lay hand on such as sought their hurt. And no man could withstand them, for the fear of them fell upon all people, ready, prepared to resist those that sought their hurt. And with the help of the governors, verse 3, and all the rulers of the provinces and the lieutenants and the deputies and officers of the king helped the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. In one sense, they were neutral. They did not have to take either side, or could take one side or the other. But because Mordecai was now the king's right-hand man, their fear of him made them to, or moved in their hearts, so that they would support the Jews. And far from what Martin might read it as such, that the Jews were going through the provinces and deliberately seeking out those who they thought might be their enemies, but rather preparing themselves, readying themselves for those who would foolishly continue their animosity and malice and seek to be victorious over them. And obviously those who were of Haman's party and his sons, his relatives. But the Jews were successful and stronger. Verse 5, thus the Jews smote all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, and slaughter and destruction, and did what they would unto those that hated them. And that included the 10 sons of Haman, and a total of 500 people in Shushan, the palace. And obviously there was quite a party of folk who were set against the Jews. I believe the Jewish writings, the Talmud says that it was the Amalekites, they were all Amalekites. Whether that is true, we don't know. But there was obviously quite a significant number of people who hated them, who were in favor of putting them to death and in taking their wealth, but ultimately they failed. It's a warning that though there were many months between after the decree allowing the Jews to resist, that still these people persisted in their purpose of animosity towards the Jews, as sadly there will be those when the Lord returns, though having been warned often, who will have persisted in their opposition to the Lord and his people, but eventually will be overthrown. So they are successful. The queen goes, speaks to the king. The king tells her what he knows, what has happened in Shushan, and asks if she has another request. And her request is simply that they might do the same, be able the same tomorrow, to resist their enemies tomorrow, and that Haman's 10 sons, who had already been killed, but would be put upon the gallows as an example, as a warning to others. and the king gives her what she has requested. And again, on the next day, the Jews gathered themselves together and slew another 300 men at Shushan. But as it says in the verse 15, but on the prey, that is the spoil, the booty, they laid not their hand, to show that they were simply defending themselves. They were not seeking to enrich themselves at others' expense, that they were defending themselves and had no intention of taking any money, any wealth, any property from those who were against them. And they were successful, they rest, and made the following day a day of feasting and gladness. Now, it is, I suppose, almost universally accepted that men are allowed to defend themselves, and we don't propagate the gospel by force. We don't defend the gospel with violence, with force, but we are allowed, we are commanded in one sense to defend the gospel and to strive for the faith once delivered to the saints. And we dare not, in one sense, despise such a command. As Jude encourages us that we are to contend for the faith, we are to defend the faith, and that, beloved, when I gave all diligence to write unto you of the common salvation, it was needful for me to write unto you and exhort you that ye should earnestly contend for the faith which was once delivered unto the saints. Sometimes it would almost appear as if Christians feel it is unchristian-like to defend the faith, that we are, when the gospel is attacked, when the essential doctrines of the scriptures are attacked, that we are to turn the other cheek. But far from it, we are to hold fast, we are to stand against such attacks. We are, as the Jews here, to be as far as possible united in resisting attacks on the faith, and to hold fast to the Lord and to those that would turn us from him, against those who would cause us to depart from the Lord Jesus Christ, and ultimately to fall under his judgment. But it is sad in every generation to see and hear of brethren who do, as it were, give way. Spurgeon's great sorrow in the latter part of the 19th century, that so many went along with evolution, the origin of species, and the theological compromises parallel to that, and seemingly just giving way, not resisting, not standing up to it. And I thought such a matter as homosexuality, it was very plain in the scriptures. Yet when I read the latest edition of the Bible League Quarterly has concerned an article about people moving in the Southern Baptist Convention in the US and changing their stance subtly in favor of homosexuality within the church, and many other issues. And one thinks, why cannot people stand firm? Why cannot people simply hold graciously, courteously, but hold to the scriptures, hold to the word of God and defend it? We go out, we witness, we seek to win souls, but we must stand, as it were, and hold fast to what the Lord has given us. There are obviously, one has to be wise. Where does one draw the line? Where does one make a stand? I don't think it's too hard. There are matters that are, in one sense, life and death to the believer, doctrines that are vital to the believer, the divinity of Christ, the doctrine of the Trinity, justification by faith alone. All these things are precious and vital to salvation. And in practical matters, moral matters that you cannot go along with, such as sexual immorality and homosexuality. I would say, though I'm sure others would not, the transgender issues, abortion, drug taking, and so on. These things are amongst those that the Lord would say, if we do these things, we will not inherit the kingdom of God. And so we have to take a stand. But do we contend in an aggressive sense against, say, pedo-Baptists? We hold to a Baptist position, and we are happy to do so and defend it from the scriptures, but we don't rail against all pedo-Baptists as false teachers. I have a number of books on an electronic hard drive put together by Presbyterians, and one of them is railing against independent church government, saying it is of the devil and so on. But we wouldn't say that, and I wouldn't want to use such speech. But the more vital areas of the faith we must hold fast, and we must take a stand. And the Jews here were upheld and enabled by the Lord to take a stand, and he will uphold his people in every generation that holds fast and takes a stand. And though we may be despised, yet the Lord will ultimately show that it's not empty or in vain. But going on in the chapter, verse 20, Mordecai wrote these things, and that I think assumes that he wrote and sent out the book of Esther, as much of it that we have, wrote these things and sent letters unto all the Jews that were in all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus, both nigh and far, because the Jews did not know the details of the deliverance, the very fascinating and wonderful workings of the Lord in his providence, and for their good and for their edification, that they would know and see the Lord's hand and see that he was on their side. It wasn't just a sort of power struggle in the court, but it was the Lord who was helping and fighting and overruling in all these things. And he sends out the details of what has gone on, and he sends out letters that they might establish these days to be kept for rejoicing and as a festival. Verse 21, to establish this among them, that they should keep the 14th day of the month Adar, and the 15th day of the same yearly, as the days wherein the Jews rested from their enemies, and the month which was turned unto them from sorrow to joy, and from mourning into a good day, and that they should make them days of feasting and joy, and of sending portions one to another, and gifts to the poor. The day after their victory, when they had rest, that is what they celebrate. They said it is set as a good day, it is not set as a holy day, because it is not prescribed in the law of Moses, but a good day to be remembered, to remind themselves of the Lord's mercy and goodness to them, and to demonstrate it by feasting and joy, joyfulness, thankfulness, gratitude, sending portions one to another, expressing their unity as a people, fellowship, and gifts to the poor, showing mercy to the poor as the Lord showed mercy to them. But precious, and here, as you may well know, this is the beginnings of the Jewish feast of Purim, named after Pur, the lot that Haman had cast, and to show that the Lord was sovereign over all these things, and the Lord will protect, and the Lord will keep his people, no matter what the pagan nations will try against them. Verse 26, wherefore they called these days Purim, after the name of Pur. Therefore, for all the words of this letter, and of that which they had seen concerning this matter, and which had come unto them, the Jews ordained and took upon them, and upon their seed, and upon all such as joined themselves unto them, so as it should not fail, that they would keep these 2 days according to their writing, and according to their appointed time every year. Now I must mention, we do think, or would suppose most likely, that Mordecai was the writer of Esther, and it was what he wrote then that became the book of Esther. But Matthew Henry makes the comment that there is a great difference in style between Mordecai and he takes Nehemiah. Nehemiah is much more devotional in nature. You have his own little prayers, interjections. Lord, remember me for good, or the hand of the Lord was with us, pointing people to see the hand of the Lord. And for his Matthew Henry's own sake, he says, I prefer that form of style. But Mordecai is in a different position. Nehemiah is writing possibly in Jerusalem, primarily for a Jewish audience, but Mordecai is writing it is going public in the whole of the Persian Empire, and no doubt to be read by the king. And so he must have a slightly different style. Does not mention, as you may well know, the name of the Lord at all. But he talks about fasting, setting aside time to seek the Lord, though he doesn't mention the Lord, and all quite discreetly put, but very plain, that the Lord's hand is over it all. And the Lord's wisdom is given to different people in different situations for whatever is necessary. And here, this book, though some might be critical of it, written with that purpose in mind. But going on, they are kept. The feast is kept, and is kept unto this day. And to remember that they were in great desperate straits, and yet the Lord saved them. And then, just briefly, these last verses in chapter 10. And the king Ahasuerus laid a tribute upon the land and upon the isles of the sea, and all the acts of his power and of his might, and the declaration of the greatness of Mordecai, whereunto the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? I.e., in those, that is where all Mordecai's career and so on, what he achieved in the service of the king, there it is recorded. But here, his part in the Lord's work to defend his people. For Mordecai the Jew was next unto King Ahasuerus, and great among the Jews, and accepted of the multitude of his brethren, seeking the wealth of his people, and speaking peace to all his seed. Nevertheless, he is not king over the Jews. He is one of them, graciously accepted by them, revered amongst them, great among the Jews. But it is that he seeks the wealth of his people, not himself, but his people, and speaking peace to all his seed. How sad often in developing countries, but even in a measure in this country, people come to high office and their main aim is self-advancement. That as soon as their time in high office is finished, they're gone from public service and they're seeking a very hefty remuneration in other ways and working upon what they have done. Some would say, well, that's fine, but here Mordecai is seeking the wealth of his people, seeking his people's good and blessing. They, as a poor or downtrodden people amongst the empire, he seeking their good and their well-being. And in one sense, our great goal to build up the Church of Christ, to edify the Lord's people in love, one another, exercising our gifts to build up the Lord's house and to encourage and help one another in our own walk with the Lord, and in that sense seeking the wealth, the spiritual wealth of his people. But briefly, the overwhelming message, the great message of Esther, which we do well to remember as the Jews remember each year at Purim, is that the Lord does protect his people and will protect his people. And we may be in seemingly very difficult circumstances with no seeming deliverance, but the Lord has planned and purposed deliverances for his people. So we must be courageous, as Esther was and as Mordecai was. We must look to the Lord as they did. We must pray, bring everything to him, but we must trust the Lord and act wisely and courageously and stand firm as the Jews did on that day. And the Lord will help and the Lord will deliver. Sometimes I preached, I don't think I have at Bethel, but sort of using the Battle of Waterloo as an illustration that there Wellington and the Allies were hard pressed, but they stood firm until the Prussians arrived to give help. They stood firm and held their position very courageously and ultimately won a very great victory that brought peace for many years afterwards. And who knows what the Lord can do with his people who stand firm and hold fast and graciously hold to the truth of his word. And may he help us, may he strengthen us, may enable us to trust in him and look to him and act, as it were, the courageous part as he guides and directs. And may we know his help and his deliverance and his blessing. Amen. Now, before we come to pray, our second hymn is number 377, based on Psalm 48. Triumphant Zion, lift thy head from dust and ashes and the dead. Okay, as we come to prayer, just a